Donal O'Donovan, it's Monday morning, it's the 19th of January at the time of this recording, and I'm curious, what punishment and potentially world-ending chaos does Donald Trump have in store for us this week?
Who knows? Who knows? Sure, it is the start of the week. The week is very young. We're still dealing with the aftermath of the weekend. So at the weekend, Donald Trump threatened to levy fresh tariffs, an extra 10% tariff on a bunch of European countries, the UK, Denmark in particular, Germany, France, and the Netherlands and the Nordics, really. It's a punitive tariff that is being levied, he says, because they have essentially sent soldiers to Greenland last week for military exercises. Greenland is Danish territory. Denmark had invited them. In the normal run of events, countries are allowed to do whatever they want on their sovereign territory. And Donald Trump doesn't think so because he wants to annex Greenland, essentially.
Yeah, so I should note as well, of course, you have prime real estate in today's Irish Independent newspaper, of course. Lots of analysis, perhaps too much analysis, really, given, like, as you say, this is a frantic and a frenzied and a fast-moving situation. How are you even keeping up with this?
I suppose what we do know is that there's the rift, which kind of rumbled through last year and was a little bit patched up. The rift between the United States and Europe is that transatlantic alliance, if you like, that's been the cornerstone of almost 100 years of prosperity, really. That is now undergoing an unprecedented crisis. So it is an extraordinary thing for ostensibly an ally of those countries to threaten them, to punish them, to try to annex territory. And notwithstanding, I guess, what happened last year with tariffs and kind of the back and forth of all that, it now looks like probably Trump has pushed things too far at the European Union. The European Union is not a party to this dispute necessarily. Denmark is a member of the European Union. Germany is a European Union member. France is a European Union member, and bar the UK, so all those other countries that are being targeted. And the European Union is essentially going to have to respond collectively to any threat to one of its members. Particularly when there's other than might is right, there is no possible justification for what's being done. And that is a difficult situation for Ireland. Ireland sits right on, if you like, the kind of the join of where the US and the European tectonic plates economically meet. And they're either crushing up against each other, which could be very painful, or they're pulling apart, which could be very, very painful. Whatever it is, where we're sitting is a very, very uncomfortable place to be at a point where that relationship is really, really being sundered.
Yeah, we'll get to Ireland specifically in just a second. And obviously, I know we started off this podcast in somewhat playful fashion because I think Trump sometimes invites such a thing. However, this is serious business. And I'm curious from your perspective as group business editor, someone who's seen a lot in the world change over the years, how worried should we be?
This is... what am I? I was born in 1976. I became a journalist in 1999 or 98 or something. I've never seen anything like this. This is extraordinary. This is potentially much worse than the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, because what you're seeing is a fundamental shift in the ordering of kind of the world economy. The sort of the pillars of stability, rule of law, kind of respect for territorial integrity, the sort of the very right of countries to exist is being threatened. The ability of the right of countries to trade with each other, the idea that would have been seen as a good thing, that's all kind of out the window. And we're drifting into very unknown territory. What we do know is, this kind of might is right attitude means that if the European Union, and Ireland is too small to do anything about this on its own, but if the European Union doesn't respond, doesn't kind of stand up, then terms are going to be dictated. They'll be dictated by the US, but then they'll be dictated by China, they'll be dictated potentially by Russia, they'll be dictated by anyone who happens to kind of have the heft to sort of impose what they want in terms of trade, in terms of how we do business, in terms of where we do business. That's really important.
Yeah, a society needs order to function, and this is complete disorder. Let's bring it to Ireland, though. So we've been left out, I believe, of Trump's latest round of tariffs and so on, in his hit list, really. Why is that, and is that good or bad news long term for us?
It doesn't really matter long term for us. I mean, we don't happen to be in it this time. it's arbitrary, so you could be in it the next time. You don't want to be relying on luck. You don't want to be relying on luck.
Yeah.
The reason we're not in it is very straightforward. We didn't send troops to Greenland. We're not a member of NATO. We're not in a military alliance. So that sort of that in that instance doesn't apply to us. We are a member of the European Union, though. Denmark is a member of the European Union, and I think it's going to be very important. If you think about the Brexit scenario where EU members showed a lot of solidarity towards Ireland, I think it'll be important that Ireland shows a lot of solidarity towards Denmark, which is under certainly economic attack in terms of those tariffs, and potentially something even more sinister in terms of what happens with Greenland. So Ireland, I mean, the old line is, just because you're not interested in the war doesn't mean that the war isn't interested in you. So Ireland can't duck this, can't avoid being involved in this, and is going to have to, I suppose, recognise that it could get very difficult. So what can happen now is the European Union is likely to respond. It may be that they respond in the immediate or the near term. So last year, people will remember the Turnberry deal, whereby the US and the European Union agreed a tariff deal. We pay 15% on most manufactured goods shipped from the European Union into the US. Ireland got a big let out on that because pharmaceuticals weren't part of it, which is our biggest export to the US. That deal may well just fall by the wayside now. It hasn't been fully ratified at the European side. That's actually due to happen on February 6th. These new tariffs that the US is threatening are due to come into effect on February 1st. If they do, I think there's no chance that the Turnberry deal gets ratified, in which case there's a whole raft of retaliatory tariffs that the European Union has kind of ready to go to impose on European goods, so that you might see on US goods coming into Europe. So you might see just more expensive goods coming from the US, more difficulty in terms of US trade. The other thing that the European Union has in its arsenal, whether it chooses to use it, is something called the anti-coercion instrument. And so that was developed a couple of years ago, really in response to potential threats from China. But I think it describes it this morning as the one for all and all for one kind of measure. So if any European Union member becomes subject to undue and unjustified kind of pressure from an outside country, the whole European Union can respond with quite sweeping and quite sort of hefty economic sanctions against that country, against businesses from that country. So, for instance, it might be more difficult for big tech companies in Europe to do business. For banks, US banks, which are hugely important to do business. The problem, I guess, from an Irish perspective with that is those businesses, if you think of tech and banks, for instance, they do their business in the European Union, often from Ireland. They'll have thousands, tens of thousands of people working here for US companies. So that really could be potentially a crunch point for Ireland, particularly if that went on for a long time. Now, ideally, what happens with the anti-coercion instrument is that it's short and sharp. The pain is real for US companies or for Chinese companies or for whoever it is that's attacking the EU, and therefore they back off. If they don't back off, obviously that's when the crunch in terms of jobs happens.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the anti-coercion instrument, the ACI. So for anyone unfamiliar with that term, let's get into the jargon of this. This stuff can be head-spinning, but you're going to break it down for us. So what exactly is the ACI? How does it work? What does it do?
It does more or less what it says in the tin. It's if the European Union believes that coercive measures are being taken against a European member, there is an anti-coercion instrument to push back, and it gives it. Like everything at European level, it's reasonably complicated and reasonably slow. So what happens is the European Union or the European Commission will be asked to investigate whether coercion has happened. They will then bring a report to the European Council, which is the heads of all the European countries, governments, who will then take a view on that report. In this case, it does look like coercion is happening. There seems to be fairly straightforward case to answer there. There would then be sort of time given for the country doing the coercing to back off or to negotiate. But ultimately, the power is there to impose real penalties on businesses from that country. So, to hit them where it hurts, which is dollars.
But that would have been possible to do last year.
It would have been possible to do last year, but the European Union didn't do it.
Why?
It's a good question. I think fear of the disruption that it would cause, fear of being seen to start a trade war in response to those US tariffs. It may be that was the wrong thing, and that it may be that they should have come out kind of swinging a bit harder initially. China did. China pushed back very hard against the US and has suffered kind of less consequence as a result, I think. The European Union essentially rolled over. And part of the context for that is the European Union is a very, very strong trading bloc, a very, very strong market, a big market for all kinds of businesses. You know, if you're a multinational, you want to be doing business in Europe. You do not want to have that market cut off you. On the other hand, the European Union faced a problem on its eastern flank in Ukraine, and they didn't want to lose US support for the Ukraine defense against Russia. And that sort of is the context of why they didn't push harder at the time, I think.
Ireland, again, it's interesting because obviously, you know, look, we are, as you say, we're too small to really kind of make a gigantic step in change here and intervene in any kind of meaningful way, perhaps. But we remain pivotal in different ways. So has our government made any comment on the desired path forward in this particular situation, this current escalation?
Yeah, I think, there's a reasonably robust statement from Helen McAtee, the Minister for Foreign Affairs. So this is a foreign affairs issue, ultimately, and a heads of government issue yesterday. So that was fairly robust. It'll be interesting to see, really, in the weeds, once, I think, European heads of government sit down together, what the mood is. I think the French will take a very, very strong stance. I think the Germans will take a very robust stance on this as well. The ACI doesn't need everyone to row in behind it. It can be implemented as a result of or through qualified majority voting at European level. In which case, everyone has to row in. It'll be interesting to see what Ireland does. Ireland doesn't tend to play hardball or go for hardball. In this instance, that may be maybe the stakes are very high. They'll be aware of that. On the other hand, I think if you don't play hardball now, you may lose the ability to play hardball later, and the consequences of that are not going to be good.
Are we seeing any of those consequences yet, though? Because as I say, we are recording this. It's right now 11:45 on Monday. Irish bank shares, for example.
Yeah, we're seeing the markets are well off this morning. Gold is at an all-time high. And gold is traditionally the safe haven in a crisis for investors. So gold has hit an all-time high. That tells you that internationally, financial people are worried. Bank shares are down. All kinds of shares are down in Europe this morning. Interestingly enough, the only shares that are up really are some of the kind of standout shares that are rising are defence stocks. So we are heading into a very uncomfortable world. European defence stocks are up. The US markets haven't opened fully, but US futures are well down. And you could see potentially European money starting to get pulled from the US, which that would have very, very serious consequences. The markets are shook this morning, but markets often will kind of overreact and underreact and things like that. You don't want to take one day of the markets as a guide to terribly much. Markets are down. There's a lot of nervousness in the world. Listeners
may themselves be nervous. There may be people listening right now who are wondering what it means for their jobs here in Ireland. Where are we at with that?
I'd say very little in the short term. I think if you work for a multinational in the short term, you're not likely to see kind of immediate consequences. What we could see in February maybe is if the Turnberry deal really is dead, then the US might revisit some of the tariffs that it places on Irish exports into the US. So pharmaceuticals potentially, whiskey, butter, those sorts of things could start to be hit. But again, that tends to play out in a reasonably long-term way. I don't think company managers are going to be rushing to cut jobs or rushing to cut pay or anything like that, because it is a very febrile and volatile situation. You want to see where you're landing before you take any kind of significant action.
Yeah, I mean, lastly, Donald, you are painting a fairly grim forecast here, so I'm just curious. Perhaps an answerable question, especially when Donald Trump is involved. What happens next?
Who knows?
It really is that level of just complete unpredictability.
Total.
Okay. Well, obviously, we will keep listeners up to date on the show, and you will be working away, I'd imagine, with a frantic pace up in the business department. So, Donal O'Donovan, thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us.
Thank you.